Right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. We may have some other people pop in. Welcome to the Career Chat. This is on creative writing, and we are fortunate. My name is Kirk Knott. I'm with the Career Center. We are very fortunate to have two accomplished center alums joining us from the field. We have Madeleine Wattenberg, and she is a Center College class of 2012, or a 2012 graduate. She is currently, now, are you finished with your PhD, or you're currently finishing?
Yeah, I'm finishing up, and I will probably be staying for a fifth year, actually, but okay. This is my fourth year, yeah.
She is actually a PhD candidate in English and creative writing at the University of Cincinnati. Her debut poetry collection, I.O., which has another pronunciation she can talk about, is forthcoming from the University of Arkansas Press in the spring of 2021. And she has published in literary journals, including the Rumpus, Sixth Finch, Fairy Tale Review, Mid-American Review, Guernica, did I say that right? Okay, close enough. And Best New Poets. And her scholarship focuses on eco-poetics and feminist poetics. And she serves also as an associate editor for the Cincinnati Review. We also have, it's Jennie Malboeuf, I hope I pronounced it correctly, center class of 03, and she is the author of God Had a Body, which was awarded the 2019 Blue Light Books Prize, and she was published in 2020 by the Indiana University Press and the Indiana Review. Her poems have appeared in the Gettysburg Review, Virginia Quarterly Review, Crazy Horse, the Southern Review, Harvard Review, and elsewhere. And Jennie also teaches writing at Guilford College, which is in North Carolina. So that's a little bit of their background, and they'll fill in the gaps. And we are going to have each of them talk a little bit about how their writing careers have evolved and developed and how they've gotten from center to where they are. And then at the end, we'll have some time for questions and answers. And Madeleine decided that she was the one who was going to kick us off. So thank you both again for being here. And you have the floor.
All right, thank you. Thank you for having us. It's really exciting to be back in some form, even if it's this virtual form. Got to shoo my cat out of the way. All right, well, it's really nice to meet all of you. So yeah, I guess I'll just walk you through a little bit how I ended up here. And I have been in graduate school for a very long time. So at Center, I was really encouraged in my creative writing by Lisa Williams, and also in my other classes where there were creative options instead of final papers. And I found myself constantly taking advantage of those, especially my philosophy classes. And so I think one wonderful thing about Center was that encouragement to think through, for me, to keep thinking through poetry as opposed to these other shapes that our thoughts can take. Because that is the way my brain wanted to think. And so I took 1 year off after undergrad and used that year to apply to MFAs and MA programs. So I can definitely answer if you have questions about applying. I'm happy to answer those. When I applied, I probably applied to about somewhere between 10 and 13 programs. I don't remember the exact number now. And then I applied to one master's program at University of Cincinnati. And I was rejected from all of the MFA programs. And I feel like that is important to share. And accepted to the one master's program. And so I took the door that opened for me, and I went to Cincinnati. And I worked with some really wonderful professors who are here. Some are still here. And I used that time to, keep working on my writing. And I still wanted to do the MFA. That was a 2-year program. And so I decided to apply for MFAs afterward in my final year. And my numbers definitely improved. I think I was accepted to 2 programs and waitlisted at 2 programs. And so I ended up accepting a spot at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And that I can talk a little bit about the difference between an MA in creative writing and an MFA in creative writing as well, although they're pretty similar. I think the MA is a little bit geared more towards literature classes, and I actually took classes with almost all PhD students, which I think was one thing that sort of opened my eyes to the possibility of the creative writing PhD, which is less commonly considered than an MFA, and I think has a different purpose as well. So I do want to talk about that a little bit. But after my master's, I trotted off to George Mason, and I was there for 2 years as well, which gave me, just more time to work on my writing. And I have thought about, what was it that changed over those 4 years? Why wasn't I accepted into MFA programs? And it's hard, like you never really know. But I think one thing about it is maybe that we talk about finding our voices a lot in writing, and I think I didn't really know who I was as a writer. I really enjoyed sort of borrowing from different people that I was reading, and trying lots of things on in my writing. But I wonder if my application at that point, my creative writing sample, which is always the most important part of any application, was sort of a little bit all over the place in terms of, it didn't really say who I was as a writer. It was sort of a sampling of different things. And so that's just one thought I've had. I don't know if that's the case. Sometimes things feel a little bit random. But then having had that experience being in the classroom with PhD students in creative writing at University of Cincinnati during my master's, while I was at my MFA, I thought that was probably going to be a good choice for me. So I decided to apply for PhD programs. And the PhD has some important differences from the MFA. I think the MFA, a lot of my friends in the program, they went on to do jobs that weren't teaching. I think it prepared them for those jobs. A lot of them, especially since it was near DC, went on to jobs in like technical writing, grant writing, copy editing. And so they sort of decided that their job didn't need to be creative writing. They are creative writers, but that didn't need to be their job. But I'm really interested in teaching. And so the PhD, and I'm also interested in scholarship as well, both sides of it. And I think the PhD is a choice for somebody who, you kind of have to love being in school a little bit. You have to enjoy a little bit of theory. You can kind of think about what theory you enjoy, but those literature classes, those theory classes, there are more of them. And technically the MFA is a terminal degree. You hear that a lot, that you'll be allowed to apply for jobs, basically, teaching, for tenure track jobs, teaching, if you have an MFA. But increasingly, and I should say also, since I'm in my 4th year of the PhD, I have been looking at the job market this year, which, as you can imagine, has been a little shattered by everything that's happened this year. A lot of departments are cutting funding. And so it is pretty tough out there in terms of jobs at colleges and universities, which is partly why I'm deciding to stay for a 5th year. But the PhD definitely gives you a little bit of a leg up, even though technically you can teach with an MFA. It especially gives you a leg up against people who are publishing multiple books. So those two things can kind of weigh each other out a little bit. Having a PhD in one book versus an MFA and having published 3 books, for example. So they're sort of different paths. I view myself as a very slow writer as well. My book that is coming out in the spring, which is very exciting, I would say is the product mostly of my time in my MFA. I was just working on my writing during those 2 years of the master's degree. And really none of that ended up in my book. It wasn't fitting in. It wasn't, again, feeling like I was still trying things on. I wasn't really sure what my voice was. And I feel like things really clicked during my MFA. And so that was when I really wrote my book in those 2 years. And it is a reworked, I was still editing, but that's a reworked version of my MFA thesis for the most part. And then the PhD, I have been working on new things, which is exciting. And I'll be working, it is a creative dissertation, which is cool. And there's sort of some more critical rigor, I guess, in the fact that we take a very intense exam following a year of reading, but that's also a really exciting kind of generative time if you're into that sort of thing, which luckily I am. And then they all have these creative dissertations. So you really get to work on a book-length collection, with pretty close advising with your mentors at the university. Trying to think of what else I wanted to say about that. I'm very open to questions about the differences between the MA versus the MFA versus the PhD. Like I said, this is my 7th year of graduate school. So one day I'm going to have to stop being a student, but I really love being a student, so I haven't minded. But you kind of have to live in the moment a little bit. I don't think it's about like rushing to that final goal of having the job, of having the career all figured out. I really enjoyed the process along the way. The job market, again, is looking a little scary. And I think I'm in poetry, just to kind of share some of the reality of it with you all. I think there's about maybe 4 poetry jobs posted right now. There will probably be more, but you can imagine all the people graduating from MFAs and from PhDs and just people who are looking to kind of move from their positions or have been looking for jobs for a while. So that is not a lot of slots for us. So another thing I've been thinking a lot about is what other sort of skills I've been developing along the way. Part of that is my work with the Cincinnati Review. And that's actually, I taught for 2 years, and then I've been working with the Cincinnati Review for 2 years, which is how I get my stipend from the program. And this is something you probably have all heard already, but you should, unless you're like really of the means, you should never attend a program that isn't fully funded. It's really important, I think, to be supported while you're writing and while you're doing your work. So I've been able to do at Cincinnati Review, they have these, or at Cincinnati, they have these alternate options, which is really nice to teaching. So you can get experience teaching, which is especially important if you're gonna go into a teaching position. I've also had the opportunity to teach literature courses, which isn't the case at every university, but is here, and I've really loved that. I've actually taught courses cross-listed with the environmental studies department. And so I can kind of market myself primarily as a creative writer and a poet, but also if they're looking for somebody who has an interest in environmental humanities, who might be able to have some sort of interdisciplinary relationship with their environmental studies department, then I can sort of put that forward and pitch myself in that direction. If they're looking for somebody to work with undergraduate literary journal in an advisory capacity, I can say I've had this experience with the Cincinnati Review, or I may even end up looking into editing jobs as well, and can kind of put that experience forward. So it is really important to kind of constantly be looking for ways to diversify diversify your skills and think about different ways from the professionalization standpoint to kind of pitch yourself beyond just sort of the singular, I write and teach poetry, I think. Okay, I feel like I've been blabbering on a little bit, so I think I will I'll calm it down here, but happy to answer questions about any of that at the end, absolutely. Oh, you're still muted.
Thank you. That was very good. Jennie, you're up.
Hi. So I'm going to play a little bit off of what Maddie has talked about. My experience is similar in some ways and also very different in others. When I came to Center, I had never heard of an MFA. I didn't know anything about it, and Lisa was my introduction to what an MFA was, and it really sounded like the right thing for me, in opposition to what Maddie
saying, Jennie, that Jennie was my first was in the first class that I taught at Center, and you made it, you know, the place I wanted to be. So anyway, I'm just going to shut up now, but I wanted to say that. Okay, continue.
Well, you made it the place that I wanted to be too. So yeah, I really didn't have a lot of direction, and Lisa was my direction. So I applied to the same graduate school that she attended. I applied to UVA, and that at the time was the place that my heart was set on going to. And so similar to what Maddie was talking about, I didn't apply to as many schools. I think I only applied to 4 at the time, which is not wise. I probably should have applied to more. But I was waitlisted at 1 and got turned down by 2 and then accepted at another. And when I was initially rejected from UVA, that felt like earth-shattering to me, because I really, again, didn't know anything else about this whole process. But I think ultimately I ended up at the right place. So I attended University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and Greensboro, out of the North Carolina system, is kind of their creative writing hub, and one of the oldest creative writing programs in the country. So I think what made this a good choice is that the community that I walked into here has really been very nurturing, and also kind of helped me, I hate using the word network, but they've helped me get some connections so that I could continue teaching. And again, on a different path than what Maddie was discussing. I was a person that was really anxious to get out of school. That was something that I think I learn a little bit better when I'm on my own. And I think that's a different thing. So I really wanted to get away from that system, and the MFA sounded like the path for that. And I attended UNC Greensboro, and while I was there, worked as a teaching assistant and a teaching intern. And eventually, in my what they call the third year, which for a lot of MFA programs, you are present for 2 years as a student, and then the third year sometimes is when you begin teaching. Other programs are 3-year programs, and then maybe you continue on after that. But UNCG, you act as a student the first 2 years, and then you have the opportunity to either work as an editor or as a teacher, a professor. And I took the teaching opportunity, which again was not something I had planned on. I had never thought about teaching. When I began attending Center, my goal was to work as a journalist. And I did end up doing that in different ways in a freelance capacity. But teaching was always the thing that kind of stuck. So once I left UNCG, I taught at one smaller college for maybe a year, also in the Greensboro area. And then through some of the folks that I knew at UNCG, I was made aware of a position at Guilford College, which is a Quaker institution, very similar to Center in a number of ways. It's a small school, Southern Liberal Arts College, just kind of a different affiliation with the Quaker community. So I've taught there since then, and it's been a tremendous opportunity for me because I've sort of through the years become what one of my colleagues says, I'm sort of the poet in residence at that school. We don't have another full-time poet on staff. It's a very small school, and we do have one, I have one colleague that serves as the writing program director, but she's on the fiction side, so I'm sort of the complement to what she does. And I've been able to teach poetry workshops and modern poetry I'm teaching right now, introduction to poetry. So courses that I'm really invested in addition to general education courses like composition and some small courses that I've been able to design myself as well. So I took a slightly different path than Maddie, although it seems like a lot of the things that we've ended up doing are very similar. School was just not the thing for me after a while. So I wanted to kind of get out of that system as a student and try to work as an instructor. And I'm also in the job market, so I understand where Maddie is right now, and I concur that there are no jobs out there at the moment. But I'm hoping that will shift soon. Yeah, I'm also open to any questions that anybody has, and I'll do my best to answer those.
Okay, thank you both. That was good information and very interesting as well. So this is the time for you guys to ask questions. We have two writers here who were sitting where you are at Center College. So I'm just going to open it up for questions, and be sure to unmute yourself, unlike I did already. But questions? Don't be shy.
Can you guys talk a little bit about the process of trying to get a collection of poetry published?
I'll take this one first. So I was also, this was something, and it's new to everybody, but it was not something I was super well versed in. But I was kind of slow to start sending work out to journals. That was something that I took several years after I graduated from the MFA program to really in earnest start sending stuff out. And once I did, it was sort of like a slow trickle that kind of turned into a much larger stream. It was kind of like one publication a year, and then two, and then three, and then, so it just kind of got a little bit more fluid after a while. But the process for me was really, I always describe it to my students like, if you're making a record, you would put out a single first, like you put out an EP, and that feels like the process to me, that you try to share bits and pieces, the individual poems in separate journals. And then gradually you kind of find that you've built up a collection. I too started, like Maddie did, using my MFA thesis as my working manuscript. And by the time that it was accepted for publication, I think only one poem remained from that thesis, and it just gradually became a completely different collection, which I think is good, because I don't really want it to feel like that voice that I had in my MFA years. I feel like a completely different person than that person. So that the process for me was first working on individual poems and getting those published, and then gradually getting to a place where a few years in, I felt comfortable enough to send out an entire collection. And some of that is to contest, and some were to just publication houses, like Milkweed is one, or larger poetry houses that would consider publishing a poetry collection. And what it kind of became this process of maybe I was in the top 10 of rejected manuscripts, and then gradually was in the top 3 of rejected manuscripts. And you get nicer and nicer rejection letters until somebody actually decides to take your collection. That was my process, at least for the last few years.
Yeah, mine was very similar. I've been sending out individual poems for a while. And I'll say, I think the most effective way to find journals is to submit to places that publish a writer that you really love, and who you sort of maybe feel a little bit of an affinity with in terms of your own work and maybe style as well. You can just go to their bio and look where they've published and kind of submit to some of those places. And also, like, don't be afraid to kind of shoot your shot when it comes to submitting, because in terms of numbers, the numbers are really overwhelming. And so you may as well just submit. Especially, you can kind of, the more you submit, the number you become to rejection, I think, which can be really useful part of the process as well. Like, the more stuff you have out, the easier it is to get a rejection and say, well, it's not that big a deal because I still have all these other submissions out. This is just kind of one. Sometimes when you're feeling a little vulnerable, the rejections hit different, but I would say, yeah, definitely, like, submit to the places you want to submit to. I mean, I have some really embarrassing submissions from like 2012 in my submission queue that I kind of roll my eyes at a little bit, but no one holds on to that, especially like as somebody who reads for a journal. No one's going to kind of hold on to that or remember that as well.
That's good to know. That's really good to know.
Yeah. Well, so Cincinnati Review gets, this is all 3 genres, but we get about 12,000 submissions in a year. That's a lot of submissions. So no one's going to remember the poem they didn't take, basically, for the most part. So yeah, it's not gonna stick out. No one's gonna like hold it over your head at any point. For my book, similar, that it was my MFA thesis, and I started submitting it. I think I submitted it a couple times in 2017, and then sort of amped up my submissions in 2018 and 2019. The book, the contest model seems to be the primary way to get your first book published. So there are these contests. It's very pay to play, which is sort of a problem with the whole system, as there are many problems with the publication system, I think. So most of these contests cost $25, $30 to submit to. And then you get, most of them are read anonymously as well. So your name isn't attached. And there are contests that are specifically for first books. So I was entering primarily those contests. You can also submit to open reading periods. I did that as well. And I actually think that a lot of the poems in my book didn't change very much. What changed a lot and seemed to be the big difference between just getting a straight up rejection versus making the finalist lists, and then finally being selected, was the order of them. I was just constantly shifting the order around. And so when you're thinking about a whole book of work, I think I discovered throughout this process that the ordering actually makes quite a bit of difference, I think, because I think the first year I got straight rejections. Second year I was starting to make finalists and semi-finalist lists, which is a really good indication that your work is going somewhere, because again, these contests are getting like 600 to 1,000 manuscripts. If you're making it into that top list, they want to publish something that is ready to go in these contests. And so it's a good sign once you get there, for sure.
I could just add to this too that I have a friend that sort of uses the rule of thumb of aiming to get 100 rejections a year or something.
Yeah, I know a lot of people that do that.
I always think that's a funny
Yeah.
rule, but I mean, it really is, if you think about what a tiny percentage actually get published. So yeah.
Anybody else? Come on. This is your chance.
I can also, oh, you have a question, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just wondering how you guys sort of get your inspiration and like your tips on how to get out of writer's block or motivate yourself to keep writing sometimes when it seems a little tough.
Yeah, this is always the question, and always a tough question, and always a good question. I think when you're in school for poetry, which you guys know, like at a certain point you just have to write something to turn it in, and I think that's really that can be like a really valuable perspective, because you could kind of wait forever for inspiration to strike sometimes. You might be waiting forever. So my primary technique is to read. I think that's the most obvious one, to go to somebody I'm really inspired by. I might even write sort of an imitation poem to see if I can play with some of their techniques. And I think anytime you can try to turn the process into play, and is sort of a way out. So sometimes I will just play with sounds. I mean, this is for poetry especially, I think, but kind of stop thinking about what I'm trying to say, or put aside the idea of trying to say something, because we put so much pressure on ourselves, I think, sometimes to have a poem that like means something. But often you don't arrive at those poems by saying, oh, I need to say this really important thing. That's something that kind of emerges out of the work just during the process. And so I really like just playing with sounds. One thing I do is, and I think actually this probably comes from an exercise Lisa had us do on homophonic translation. But I really like writing poems where I start with a line and then I just think of words that sort of remind me of the words in that line, and sort of go under, sort of like pulling these words apart and finding other words inside of them. And that's just like one example of play that I might turn to, and it also kind of releases the pressure of, oh my gosh, I have to come up with like a poem, a complete poem that like says something. And sometimes it goes nowhere, and sometimes I discover a line that I really like, and that allows things to open up a little bit. So that's just one example. Yeah.
I'll just speak to not putting pressure on yourself. That was something for a long time. I think I kept putting such a weight on myself about one thing I find myself doing is thinking I've already written about that, so I shouldn't write about that more. And it's such a ridiculous rule that I make up in my mind. Like I've already written 15 poems about my family, or I've already written 15 poems about this particular experience that I went through. And I inevitably will always get to a place where I didn't pick up that rock yet and look underneath it. Mm-hmm. So there's always something. It will come. And the other thing too is I tend to put pressure on myself sitting down to write. If I don't get something to turn out the way I want it to on the first or second or third try, I think, well, I just wasted that idea on that poem and it didn't go anywhere. And I have to remind myself, and sometimes other people have to remind me, that sometimes you have to write those poems that don't totally click to get to the ones that do. And you have to push past. And so I've started to try to teach myself that even stuff that in my mind I consider bad has helped me get to things that were better. So that's helped. It's not really an inspiration answer, but it's a frustration answer maybe. So.
I was wondering what your criteria are for were for choosing which MFA programs to apply to. Like, what did you consider?
What I considered, going back to what I was talking about earlier with meeting Lisa when I was at Center, what I considered is, sounds ridiculous now, but I applied to UVA because that's where Lisa went, and I applied to the UNC system because that's where Dr. Lucas, I think, went to UNC Chapel Hill. So I was just choosing schools based on what I had seen professors do, even though, he went there for a PhD. I just was choosing not at random, but sort of basing my decisions off of what I had seen other people do. I am a first generation college student. So this was something that was, the whole universe was kind of new to me. And the other schools that I think I chose to apply to, one was completely at random. That was University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa. And I found it and I applied and I got waitlisted there. And then the other was, I think, Houston. And there might have been a poet that worked there at the time that I was interested in potentially working with. So I just randomly applied there. Just to talk about how naive I was, I thought all these places are probably not very far away. I was not even geographically thinking about what I was doing. So I'm glad that I ended up where I did for a number of reasons. But yeah, two of those schools I chose because I knew professors that had gone to those places or in general, the location. And then one was completely at random and one was because I wanted to work with a writer. And that was really my process. And I ended up going to the school that accepted me.
Yeah, it is so overwhelming. Even now, just thinking about trying to, if I would do it all over again, that would overwhelm me. There used to be this ranking basically. And I definitely looked at the ranking and was like, what are the top schools? But of course, everybody else is doing that as well. And I don't think that list exists anymore. And I kind of hope it doesn't as well. Because I think it's kind of misleading. Funding I think is really important. Is it a school that is going to give you enough to live on so that you can focus on your writing? Unless, there were some people at George Mason who had full-time jobs and then they would take their creative writing classes, and I don't want to say it was a hobby for them because they were very serious about their writing, but they had a different mindset. And that's of course acceptable. But I think if it's the thing you really, really want to focus on, then you need to be financially supported. Another thing I think I would do looking back is look, of course, at the faculty. Do I like what they're thinking about? But I think I would also check out student publications and and see like what are the students they're accepting, what are they writing, what are they thinking about. The faculty make a huge sort of part of the program, but looking back on my many hundreds of years of graduate school, my cohorts, the people in my classroom, my peers, were just as much a part of that experience, if not more maybe. And being inspired by their work has been really important. You know, they're the ones in your workshop who are giving you feedback. So what are they thinking about in their work? So I think we'd actually check out student work more as well. And then I think location actually is really important, because you want to, again, I think it's about like thinking about where you want to put your energy during your time there. And so you kind of want to live in a place that isn't a drain on your energy, that either inspires you or you just kind of feel comfortable in. That's partly why I wanted to come back to Cincinnati. I could have gone to Utah, Salt Lake City for my PhD as well, which could have been really cool. But when I was thinking about location, I was like, I know Cincinnati, I know I'll be comfortable there. I know I won't spend a lot of time being anxious about my environment. Maybe that's a personal thing a little bit as well. But I think, you know, that does matter, that you wanna live somewhere that you are happy living in, because otherwise you're gonna kind of be a little miserable too. Yeah, so I think those are kind of my main things, looking back on it all.
Any other questions?
I was going to ask, I guess, how do you balance maybe writing and working on your writing with like your academics? Just because I personally have trouble maintaining that, and also like I get sucked into one or the other kind of.
Yeah, I can go first on that one, since I'm still kind of there, I guess. Sometimes I don't, is maybe the way to start off. I think I relate to that a lot. You know, sometimes I have these scholarly essays that I'm working on. Often they're about poetry, but the actual work I'm doing isn't writing poetry. And again, I am a slow writer, so I mean, I will go months without writing, depending on what the situation is. And I think, like, again, releasing that pressure from yourself, like you don't have to be a fiction or a poet factory. You don't constantly have to be producing. It's okay to take breaks. And kind of lean into your scholarly work or your other work sometimes, or just like, you know, it's okay to have a life as well. And often, you know, the best time is when those two things do really unite, so that the critical work I'm doing, even if I'm not writing poetry in that moment, ultimately the critical work is going to feed into something creative that happens later. It's fueling my ideas about poetry or about literature, even if it's not fueling the production of a poem. And so I think ultimately I've just learned to give myself that space, because I'm not good at multitasking. I have to focus on one thing at a time. And yeah, sometimes poetry isn't the most important thing that I'm doing. Sometimes thinking about somebody else's poetry is the most important thing, or, you know, meeting that other deadline is the most important thing, and surviving is the most important thing. And so it's okay to kind of let your priorities shift around a little bit, I think.
I've also found just being an instructor for, 15 years now, that I get nervous when the semester starts, because I feel like I'm going to lose the time to be able to work on things that, you know, are personally important to me with my poetry. But I've also found, ironically, that during periods of intense grading, which I'm in right now, I had about 60 papers that were turned in last week that I'm trying to work through. And all of these papers are written about poetry. So I'm getting to read students' reflections on, I read a couple last night that were on Eliot, and another student wrote about Langston Hughes. So I'm getting to read what these students are thinking about with poetry. And typically, ironically, this always happens that when I'm in the middle of a stack of papers, I have lots of ideas for things. So when I should be doing something else, those ideas come. I mean, that's life irony, right? Like that you feel like you don't have time for something, and that's when everything just sort of pops up. So I've gotten to the point where I actually kind of look forward to those weeks that are heavy, because I feel like it maybe it's just the flood of words that are coming into my head from other people's writing. It starts to trigger some things, and things start floating to the surface. So I think that was a balance that took me a long time to get a hold of. But once you start recognizing the pattern of it, you relax a little bit. So that's helped.
Anybody have any additional questions? We're getting a little close to our finish, and I want to be respectful of time, but I think we do have time for one more question.
If someone else has one, I'm going to ask another one, if that's okay.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about like the differences and kind of pros and cons between a chapbook and the collections? Like I've had some people tell me like, oh, like you should go for a chapbook, and other people tell me like, why not just do a collection? Like, you know, if you're going to put them together, why not do that? And like, yeah. Did you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's actually funny because I have been having this conversation with friends, because, okay, there are definitely assumptions about the differences between chapbooks and full lengths, that this is my personal belief, that I think tie into some sort of like elitism, even like somehow book length works are like superior to chapbooks. I would really love if that weren't a thing, and that chapbooks were sort of rethought of as a little bit of a different, maybe not like a different genre, but a different shape for how a group of poems can look together. Obviously a shorter shape, maybe a more like concentrated, focused shape than a book length. And of course, either of those could kind of do similar work to the other one. So I think the reality is that chapbooks aren't taken as seriously as book-length collections. But I don't think that should be a reality. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. And I do think it's changing a little bit. Like I can think of some really successful chapbooks, like Tiana Clark's Equilibrium, for example, is just one that pops to mind that I think, and that's from Bull City Press. They make really beautiful chapbooks. That was one that, you know, got read a lot. I think they tend not to be, you know, promoted as well. So there's like that marketing aspect and getting eyes on it aspect. But there's something really wonderful about like the length of a chapbook, I think, because you can sit down and read it through and like really experience the whole collection of it. So yeah, those are just some of my thoughts on that.
I'll also add to what Maddie was saying that there's a writer, Chloe Honum, who also published a chapbook with Bull City that is wonderful. It's called Then Winter. She visited Guilford last fall as part of, I don't even know why we called it this, but she's an emerging writer, I guess. Now she has 2 books and a chapbook at this point. But her work is exquisite, and that chapbook, every single poem in it had a particular place and served a purpose. So to me, it becomes this sort of like special and very precious thing to to see something function in that way. So I was always hesitant to send out, when I was working on my book, to send out a section of it as a chapbook, but that's something that I'm considering doing now. I have technically enough poems for a second book, but I'm not totally comfortable sending it out as a collection yet. So that's been something that I've been sort of toying with, taking about 20 to 30 poems out of what I have and seeing if they will work as a chapbook, and building them kind of with that mindset that I was talking about with Chloe Honum, just having something that it feels like every single piece serves a particular purpose in a very different way than in a full-length book. You can get microscopic with how specific things work together, I think. I don't know, in a different way. But there are so many chapbooks that I've really enjoyed, and I agree with Maddie. I don't think that they should be thought of as secondary to a full-length collection. One of my favorite books that I bought when I was a student at Center, I was in Dr. Lucas's Faulkner course, and we went to Oxford, and there's a really nice bookstore in Oxford, and really small, I don't even know if it was considered a chapbook, but just a very, very brief collection by Charles Simic called Jack Straws, that just had a small number of poems. But it was kind of the first exposure I had to something that would function, and it was really, really small. So yeah, I'm a fan.
Thank you, guys.
I want to give you all each of our writers a chance to share any closing thoughts. We're kind of pushing up here toward the end, so either of you want to have a closing thought?
Not really, but if I'm happy to exchange my email address if you guys have follow-up questions. I'm more than happy to be a resource, because I think the more people you can ask questions to and sort of have at your disposal, the better. So
that's very gracious. And if you need that, you can contact me and I'll give it to you. Or if you want to put it in the chat right now,
I can do that.
That might be an option as well. But thank you. Jenny, did you?
Just thank you for having me, and I really appreciate the questions. And I would also be happy to talk with anybody via email. So.
Okay, if you guys just put it in your chat, that would be good. And then also, if you don't happen, I'll leave the meeting up for a little bit so you can access the email if you need to. But you can also contact me and I'll get it to you as well. And my name's Kirk Knott again, and I know most of you guys have Mindy as your Division I counselor, but some of the names I recognize. But anyway, thank you both so much. This was great. I think it was really good and very thoughtful. I can tell you're both writers.
Thank you so much to the two of you for doing this. And also I want to say that when the pandemic is over, we'd love to think about having maybe the two of you coming together to give a reading, or maybe have a small alumni event where several of you, there are a couple more that have books coming out. That could be a really fun thing to do. So
I would love
I'll
that.
be in touch with that. We've got to get through the next 6 months or so. And today.
Today, we have to get through today.
Yeah.
Yeah, go vote, everybody. Don't forget to vote. Okay. Well, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.